To create a jeans hem, I'm going to walk you through all the steps for how to get your seam, do some top stitching, then how do you get up and over that big bulky seam using an optional multi-purpose tool available from Husqvarna Viking. So first off, I'm going to start by creating my seam. I've got the right sides together. The sewing advisor has been set for woven heavy and a seam. Now by setting it there, it's made the stitch length longer. It makes it to 3.0, making it so the stitches aren't really tiny as we work with the thicker fabrics. So I'm going to just set it for a 5/8 seam allowance. That's at the 15 millimeter line on the throat plate. Stitch all the way down, back stitch, and then cut the threads. Now before we actually go into making our hem, I'm going to detour for just a little bit and show you how I like to do some top stitching. When we take our seam, if we fold it, and you can fold it or press it open or to the side, whichever you'd like, I'm going to actually use a foot called an edge joining foot. It's a foot that actually has a blade in the middle to help me make straight seams. And believe it or not, I cannot sew straight without a foot, a line, a guide, something along that line to keep my eye going where it needs to go. Now, instead of making the seam right down the center, I'm going to move the needle position to the far left. The screen should show minus 3.5 as it moves it from 0 in the center to the left side. Once again, the stitch length is at 3. If you leave it at anything smaller, it really looks tiny on this, and our orange thread will really show up nice on here. If I was doing this for real, I would have pressed this open, but what I'm going to do is just take my fingers, kind of pull it apart. When you're done, we're going to see how straight this seam looks. And that blade I'm just keeping right next to the seam, and then we'll cut our thread. Okay, see how perfect that is? We're going to find that next we're going to turn the fabric up 2 times. We're going to bring that needle back to the center needle position, so back to 0.0, or where the number is no longer highlighted. Change back to a foot A for the rest of our seam. Now, when we talk about a hem, when we fold this up, again, press everything in place for what we're working with. And when they talk about top stitching, they mean just that. We want to stitch from the top side. You actually get a better seam from this side. We're going to find, though, as we approach this larger seam, again, you can watch the lines on the side here so you have a nice even hem. We have a very thick part we're going to go over, and you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you approach this and it almost is like a wall that you need to go up. Set the machine to stop with the needle in the down position. So up to the seam as far as you can go until the toes start to angle up towards you. This is where you start to get little stitches. You start to push the fabric, you can break needles, and it's just not a fun, and it doesn't always look nice and even. So we're going to use the multi-purpose tool. Once again, this is an optional accessory and it has multiple uses. You'll see it being used when we sew on buttons that need a shank. And do you notice there's a little hole right here? That hole is actually squared off at the top. It's flat, so if I drop a needle in there, it would help in inserting that needle. So if you have trouble with your hands getting in there just because it's awkward, drop the needle in, lift it up, loosen and tighten the screw, and it is a lot easier to insert a needle. Okay, so as our foot is aiming up here, we can take one more stitch, the needle's down. You're going to lift up the foot in the back. And do you notice that this side is thicker than this side? Depending on how thick your seam is, you'll use either one. So if you have a super thick seam, use the thicker one. For this one, this is a medium denim, so I'm going to use the smaller side. You're going to come behind the foot and slide the tool until it stops at the seam. When you lower it down, your feet will now be, or your foot is now sitting on both the tool and the seam, and they're practically level. So this is kind of like what, as I describe it, the Panama Canal, as they take the ships and move them from lock to lock. So I'm not even having to push it or pull it, and that's because the foot is level as it's coming across the plateau of the thicker seam. Now, once again, we're about ready to jump off the thickness here. Take the tool, slide it underneath the toes, and stitch into it until you feel like when you stop and take the tool out, the foot will come down on level ground. We'll just stop there, cut our thread. And you can see how easy and that is to get up and over that thickness and how even those stitches are. Another thing that I will often use this tool for is, let's say you're starting right on the edge of something really thick. Or worse yet, even something where the fabric is fluffy, it's squishy, your foot's trying to get on it, but it's not taking really nice stitches. See how angled this foot is? There's just no feed dogs touching the back of this foot, so it's really hard to get it started. If we lift up the presser foot, slide the thicker side underneath the back, pretty much just to support it, you can have that first stitch start right at the edge of the fabric without any trouble at all. And they'll just kind of pop out the back once it's done there. And like always, use a denim needle when you're working on the denim fabric.